Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so picking back up with Justice League rather from Scott Snyder, this one's actually kind of cool. This is a really cool little bit of a story, and the reason why is because again, it kind of feeds into the whole event of like the totality, right? Like that's really what's been going on here. Is you have the totality, basically what seemed like a shard of the source wall, or at least something akin to it, that just kind of careened through space and time, and then eventually landed on Earth, and then everything kind of popped off. But around the time that happened, and this is really where the story kind of picks up, is Starman arrived. Now, in reality, Starman had been experimented on and so on by Lex Luthor, right? Like we talked about that in the previous videos, that Lex Luthor traveled to the past in order to understand the totality and experimented on Starman because Starman himself gained his powers after he was hit with a piece of the totality. And because nobody really knew what it was when it first arrived on Earth, nobody really knew the basis behind it except for Will Payton, who had long since seemed to have been gone and removed from the picture. The only way to really figure out what was going on was to travel into the past and try to figure out how he worked. Now, of course, Lex Luthor being Lex Luthor basically meant like torture. But the fact remains that with Will Payton having arrived in the modern day and basically like showing up on the doorstep of the Justice League, Batman's been trying to understand what in the world's going on with this and like how Will Payton ties into that. And what he's been doing is taking Jarro, like the small piece of Starro, and basically attaching it to Will in order to scan his mind and understand how it all works. Now, Batman's been hooking himself up to it, to a degree as well, in order to basically read Will Payton's mind, kind of explore his mind through the Starro concept. But of course, again, like when it comes to any form of Starro, it's an astronomical amount of power, and it's so much that it can overwhelm almost anybody, and even Batman almost dies in an attempt to make it happen. Now, the other half of this is, again, with the kind of power that Starman possesses, all it would take is like one wrong turn and like everything would cease to exist, right? Like it's one of those extreme examples of the massive amount of power that he contains within his mind. And again, it's kind of cool, but the funny thing about this is that the Starman concept is actually sort of a background thing to all this, where we would expect answers almost right off the bat. We don't really get that. Instead, what we do is we shift over to Thanagar Prime. Now, of course, Thanagar Prime is home to like the Thanagarians, but really like Hawkgirl and Hawkman. But for those of you guys who are familiar with the concept of Hawkgirl, when like the Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, and Hawkgirl arrive on this planet, they're immediately met by Shayera Hall after a bit of a fight breaks out. Now, those of you guys who are familiar with that are kind of like, but like that doesn't make any sense though. And that was my first thought. My first thought was like, what? Like that? No. That's Hawkgirl. So like Hawkgirl's meaning Hawkgirl. This will all make sense here in a little while. But in the interim, of course, because of the fact that Shayera is very familiar with him and she has been around for a little bit, again, we'll kind of tie all that up together here at the end of the story. What ends up happening here is she knows the Justice League are friends and basically speaks with the Justice League directly. Now, in terms of the reason why the League is here, is for a couple different things. Of course, a kind of party, like a big celebration is already taking place anyway. So for these three folks are just kind of mingling, hanging out, talking, and so on and so forth. But then you also have John Jones, who's sort of been in this pursuit of like information in relation to what's left of the Green Martians, with the nature of his people. Some of that comes out of the solo series, and some of that are themes that are kind of been on running throughout the book. But it's basically searching for like the Keep, which is basically a person who exists for the purpose of like maintaining the records, right? So it's kind of like the great record keeper of the Martian race. And Manhunter's essentially been looking for her in order to understand like how all this works, right? Like everything with his people and so on and so forth. Because remember, there's a lot of things that are being changed up when it comes to the character of Martian Manhunter. And so for people who are new to DC Rebirth, it works out because for old school fans, there's a lot of familiarity here. For people who are new, they're getting into it for the first time, and it all kind of ties in together exceedingly well. But as these kind of conversations and these different discussions go on, what ends up happening is that Hawkgirl approaches Shayera and basically says like, do you understand what's going on with my wings? Can you read whatever this is? Because remember, with Hawkgirl's wings, there's these intricate designs and patterns that are showing up there, and it's kind of strange because she doesn't really know what it is. And Shayera seems to have this kind of initial response like she does know, but then she responds by simply saying, well, no, I have no idea what that is. I don't know. I wish I could read it, but that's it. And then of course, when Shayera touches Hawkgirl, suddenly there's this kind of mental feedback that sort of punches into things. And then that's when she gets a hold of John Jones. And we end up finding out that what's actually been going on here in Thanagar is that the Martian Keep is present on this planet. Now, Shayera had mentioned that in passing insofar as she told John Jones, the Keep was here at one point, but it's not anymore. Like the Keep is no longer here. She passed on. She's dead. And so it really seems seems duplicitous to a degree. The other part part of this is that when Hawkgirl begins to kind of figure out what's going on, in the sense that there are lies that are being told here, that when she basically tells Jon Stewart and she tells Jon Jones, that leads into like the response of basically like Savage Hawkman showing up here. Now again, for those of you guys who are familiar with the Hawkgirl and Hawkman mythos, you're probably just kind of scratching your heads like, what in the world is going on? Why is Savage Hawkman here? Because he should basically be dead. But it's really kind of hitting all the right marks, because you've literally got Savage Hawkman tearing apart Hawkgirl. And you would expect that in this circumstance, because the two of them are essentially lovers who were destined to like die and be reborn and to always find each other, that as soon as Carter Hall sees Hawkgirl, that he would just kind of be like, you're her, and like they would be together. But that's not what plays out. Instead, it's basically Shira Hall who has Savage Hawkman, Carter Hall, as her lover, and is saying like, kill this girl. And so it's very intriguing, because as we go through this, what we end up finding out is that where this appeared to be Hawkgirl, the fact was that it actually wasn't. It was Martian Manhunter tricking Shira and Savage Hawkman into basically like believing it was Hawkgirl. It's actually super smart. It's a cool little thing to sort of throw in here to kind of include in this bit of a story. But the reason why they're going to the vaults is because the vaults of Thanagar are basically like legendary. In all the places in all the universe, the vaults of Thanagar is the most secure place in all existence. If you have something that you want to keep protected, Thanagar is the place to have it. The problem here is that it takes forever to get anything into that vault. There are people who wait years, and like you have to submit a request, and it could be decades before you hear a response. It's that sought after, and it's that well protected. What they end up doing is kind of stowing away. Now, this kind of flies in the face of everything Snyder says, right? Like, you cannot easily break into Thanagar. Like, it's designed to basically like keep itself hidden. But the people who guard it only ever really look for shapeshifters in the form of like walking, talking beings. Nobody ever considers artifacts. And so that's kind of the cool thing here, is when you have one of the Dominators who shows up here with a giant shard of Krypton and says, hey, look, like this thing's got crazy properties, and we want to see if we can use it to find a way to like duplicate the powers of the Kryptonians, or at least to like duplicate the ability for them to like draw power from sunlight and so on. Of course, they were given approval by Thanagar. They bring the artifact only for us to find out it was basically Martian Manhunter and the Green Lantern Hawkgirl masquerading here. But for Martian Manhunter himself, he starts speaking directly with the Martian Keep. And this is when answers start getting revealed. This is when things kind of start spilling out all over the place and basically telling us, exactly what's going on. And what we learn is that the multiverse as it exists now in DC Comics is not the first one. It's that the multiverse as it existed before this one was created by Perpetua. And she basically had like all these forces at her disposal, and her power was extreme. Eventually she was defeated and she was locked behind the source wall. And then the Guardians of the Universe, being as cryptic as they are, basically eliminated almost all knowledge they could of her. And that knowledge, what knowledge remained, was basically locked away in the Thanagarian vault. As a result of this, with the Martian Keep showing up here, this really serves two purposes, or at least, with her existing here, serves two purposes. One, she has access to all that information. But two, the other part of it is, now that information is being sought and now that knowledge of Perpetua is out there, she's going to make a return. But with this information basically being thrown out there, the other half of this, and what we learned with some of the information, is that it basically sets in motion this basically kind of change up, this retcon of the origin of Martian Manhunter, which we'll actually cover in another video. But at the moment right now, in terms of what's going on here, what Martian Keep basically tells the Manhunter is, not everything here is what it seems. In fact, nothing here is what it seems. Nothing here is real. That basically, like, this system as it exists is because of like the Absorbicon, literally an artifact that's hooked up to me that's designed to kind of recreate Thanagar. But once I die, this will all fall away. And when it does, chaos will ensue. And that's exactly what happens. Basically, like, the Martian Keep dies and then everything starts falling apart. Literally, like, the entire illusion of like Thanagar starts to fade away. And that's when we begin to realize what's going on here. That Hawkman as he existed was not real. Savage Hawkman was not real. He was a construct. Shira is here, and she's basically creating like this giant illusion of like a reinvigorated and fixed Thanagar. That's why, for those of you guys who have been going through and been keeping up with DC, where Thanagar was basically in shambles and it seemed perfectly fixed and back to the way it was, and even a little bit better before it was almost completely and totally collapsed, the question was, how did it get that way? This is how. And so in the middle of this great big huge conflict that goes on and everything basically going to pieces, suddenly you end up having the arrival of Starman and the Justice League from Earth. And this is kind of a cool little thing. In reality, it's kind of Scott Snyder making it work for the story, but also kind of making his, like, giving himself a hole, like giving himself a way out. What Starman basically says is like, Shira as she exists is basically not supposed to be here. Technically, she's not supposed to exist. this. And the reason why is because she's one of the personalities of Hawkworld, or one of the beings that Hawkworld was at some point in the past. Remember, when it comes to Hawkman and Hawkworld, they're constantly reborn. And where those physical forms will die, their essences will basically dissipate and then be reborn in another form. So technically speaking, Shayera Hall should be dead and gone, and then the existing Hawkgirl should be the only version of herself that's out there. But somewhere along the line, Perpetua feared the fact that if Hawkgirl was fully formed, which is to say there was no fraction of herself missing and floating out there in the form of another being, then what would happen is a Hawkgirl who was fully integral would be a threat to Perpetua. And so what she did is she split her in half. And that explains how Shayera Hall's been here as part of DC Rebirth. And so again, like, Starman kind of fixes that. He doesn't really kill Shayera so much as he says, look, like, the essence of you that belongs to Hawkgirl, I'm taking away. And I'm putting that directly into Hawkgirl so she's fully formed, but you still have your own soul. Shayera Hall is now a singular being. Now, this can create problems later on down the line. This is how he ran into problems with like Donna Troy, things like that. This is how you run into those kind of issues. So I'm curious how Scott Snyder will keep this going forward without running into continuity issues. If he doesn't resolve it, somebody else later on will have to try to find a way to figure it out, or it'll just be one of these things where it goes on forever and this old version of Hawkgirl's floating around in the DC universe and nobody knows what to do with her, and then she's just kind of appearing every once in a while. So again, it can kind of create problems. This is how those things sort of start. Now, in the moment, what you basically have now is Shayera Hall, this older version of Hawkgirl, who's out there with her own essence and spirit and experiences and so on, but the part of her that should have passed on and become the new Hawkgirl has now been returned to the new Hawkgirl. So she's fully formed and fully together. And so following that, the statement of Starman is there are a zillion things across this universe that are all broken, that are all screwed up, and they need to be repaired, and we'll start with the source wall. The reality of this is that where you look at Jeff Johns and Doomsday Clock, and Jeff Johns says, okay, so like basically Dr. Manhattan screwed stuff up. He made some changes here and there, and now this is what the universe looks like now that those changes are made. Where Doomsday Clock seems like it'll undo that, this almost kind of seems like Scott Snyder's way of undoing it on his own. And basically saying, like, imagine if like Doomsday Clock never happened, but like we're trying to find a way to bridge the gap between New 52 and DC Rebirth. This kind of seems to be the answer for it. It's intriguing. I'm sure it'll all basically consolidate and it'll all kind of make sense once it's said and done, but it is intriguing to see how it plays out and to see how all this kind of unfolds. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.